Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to our presentation called Relationships and Storytelling, Graduate Students' Efforts Towards Inclusive Decolonized Teaching. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are on the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect that the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We also recognize that acknowledgement is not enough. Universities are colonial institutions that have done and continue to do harm to Indigenous peoples. As a group, we commit to learning and listening and working toward true reconciliation within the university community and beyond. As Beth said, my name is Melanie Doyle. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an educational developer within CITL responsible for graduate student teaching development. And I'm joined today by three extremely talented graduate students who will introduce themselves shortly. Before we can begin, I'd first like to share a tidbit or two about myself in the context of graduate student teaching. While I still teach, it's been a number of years since I myself embodied this dual role of student and educator that my co-presenters now inhabit. My first teaching experience was as a graduate student in 2015 in the Eastern US. I was in the New England area. And my first few semesters of teaching in this context were drastically shaped by the 2016 US presidential election, which came, I think, just after a year after this photo was taken. My, social media performance of celebration that the semester is finally over. I was teaching first year writing at the time, and most of my students in the classroom, it was a small class of 18, were first generation in their family to be born in the US and first generation to attend college. And they just voted for the first time. And I felt very much an outsider as the educator in that room. I was white, monolingual Canadian, who was still trying to construct my own pedagogical identity while also being expected to steward these angry 18-year-olds through a moment of political, social, and racial upheaval that I could really only begin to comprehend in the most basic sense. Now, in my current role as an educator developer supporting graduate students through their own teaching development, I carry a lot of those feelings, my own feelings of discomfort and confusion with me, and do my best to help these student educators navigate their dual roles, because it can be a point in a position of confusion and difficulty, but also great success. At Memorial, we're fortunate to have growing opportunities for graduate students looking to develop their teaching experience. Primarily, that is through our Teaching Skills Enhancement program, which is available to any graduate student in any of Memorial's campuses. And through this program, students complete a semester-long apprenticeship in their discipline, during which many of them teach independently at the undergraduate level for the first time. Not all, some come into the program with teaching experience already, TA experience, teaching in the community, years of tutoring, you name it. The students bring a wealth of knowledge and experience with them already. My three co-presenters this morning, Carol, Keif, and Cara, each completed the Teaching Skills Enhancement program this year and come from different disciplinary backgrounds and brought with them a range of life, work, educational, and teaching experiences. As I kind of hinted at earlier, beginning to teach as a graduate student can be a challenging position. And some of the main challenges that are often reported from graduate students include adjusting to mid-semester crises or changes, time limitations, and a lack of authority that you can feel sometimes when stepping into that instructor role for the first or one of the first times. However, the duality present when graduate students, move to the front of the classroom, if we're thinking in the very, I think, westernized image of a classroom, can also afford many, many opportunities. And that's really what we hope to tap into today. As graduate students begin to discover their own pedagogical beliefs, student educators are really well equipped to recognize and repel the harmful colonial institutions and power dynamics that can often exist between instructors and students. Student educators are inherently able to embrace both of these perspectives together, which, as these TSEP students have recognized this past year, can lead to more culturally competent teaching that benefits all students. So in the remainder of our presentation, my co-presenters will reflect on and share strategies for working toward more inclusive, decolonized teaching, practices and strategies they have discovered and created while really embracing their best of both worlds as students and instructors. In our planning for today's presentation, we felt that any work that really takes place in this classroom learning environment ultimately involves co-constructing rich reflections comprised of multiple subjectivities and narratives. So with that in mind, I'd first like to invite our three student educators to first share their own story, to consider their own social location, and share how it's informed the work we set out to do today. I'll pass it over to you, Carol.
Oh, Carol, you're muted.
Muted. Sorry about that. Ani, bonjour, hello, my name is Carol. My pronouns are she, her. It is common practice for Indigenous people to share who we are, where we come from, and who are our people. This is a picture of me and my son, Jonathan, and I live in Ajax, Ontario, which is situated on the Mississaugas of Scugog First Nation territory. If you're interested in learning where you live, you can explore the traditional territories on nativeland.ca. I am Saulteaux on my mother's side, and I'm Métis on my father's side. And I'm a member of Kisiku's First Nation territory, which is in Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. My mother was a residential school survivor, and I'm the first of her 7 children to obtain a university degree. My son is currently a journeyman in the trades. Our life experiences, our learning, and our stories as Indigenous people have shaped who we are, and it influences what we do. Indigenous leader Blair Stonechild said, "Education is the new buffalo." I strongly believe that education is the path for a prosperous future for the next 7 generations. I currently work in the Indigenous education field in post-secondary, and I am deeply passionate about education as a vehicle for healing and identity. Next slide.
Hello, everyone. I've already been introduced, but my name is Cara Brewer, and I'm based out of the Memorial Grenfell campus, so located in Corner Brook, Newfoundland. And, you know, as a white, cisgendered, able-bodied woman in the biological sciences, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of working with many smart, successful, female-identifying researchers. So I have this incredible sense of belonging in my field that I recognize is a privilege, and recognize that not all students of various identities feel when they enter the biological sciences. However, I also have a ton of experience recreating in the outdoors. And in those spaces, often I am the only woman, and I see myself as a minority, and I feel the burden of being a minority in those spaces. So while it can be incredibly empowering representing my gender in these spaces that are largely dominated by male identifying individuals, it can also be quite a burden. I'm carrying the weight of an entire identity when I'm the only person around people that look and act differently. And that burden can look and be shown differently, but as a rock climber, it looks like me walking up to the area where we climb and noticing I'm the only woman and feeling like I have to go up the route first to show that I'm strong and I'm brave and I can represent women doing these difficult things without fear. When I'm backpacking, often it's me carrying a heavy load and maintaining a positive attitude and really just making sure that I'm representing the identity of women by showing that we're strong, we're brave, we can, you know, huff it to the top of the hill. And as a skier, although I recently got into it, I noticed the same feelings of, you know, showing that I'm brave, that I can pick a speedy line and really just maintain this atmosphere of women can do this too. So with all of that context, I mean, these are very literal examples of carrying the extra weight of my identity. And in the classroom, a lot of these minority students who identify with minorities are feeling the same burden in a much more figurative way. They feel this sense of representing their identity sometimes when they're the only person that identifies that way in our classroom. And so this feeling of being a minority in the outdoors has really influenced the way that I see students who maybe don't have the same sense of belonging that I have in the biological sciences. And it's something that has really educated the way that I teach, because I want to ensure that I'm showing the students that they are in fact not the only people in the biological sciences that identify the same way, and that they're not paving the way. They don't have to carry the burden of being a minority. They don't have to carry the extra weight in their backpack to get up the hill. They have people in place that are paving the way for them and shattering that figurative glass ceiling. And those people are really who that they can rely on to have made the space for them in these fields. Thank you. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. So as we've been doing, it's important to locate oneself in their work. My name is Keif Bukini. I'm a white settler of French and Irish descent, early 30s, socialized as a heterosexual cis man. I come from a background that would be considered lower middle class. I'm the first in my family to pursue graduate education. I have no significant history of medicalization or psychiatrization. I do not identify as being disabled. And so my location, socialization, and upbringing are all, extremely normative. And as such, I recognize that I enjoy a significant amount of privilege, which has impacted my choices for an ability to perform academic work, and the way people interact with me and the expectations placed upon me. I'm continually working to recognize and to destabilize the effects of my privilege. However, there will still inevitably be times when I fail to do so, and regardless of my intention, my actions do contribute to racist, ableist, sanist, and sexist discourses. So when this comes to teaching, I think this work of locating oneself becomes even more important, because now there are students from a multiplicity of backgrounds and social locations coming to learn. Thus, the privilege of my various positionalities inevitably informs my pedagogy. So in locating myself, I'm working on unraveling the multi-layered threads of oppression and understanding the sources and causes of these positions. Coming from the disciplinary standpoint of sociology, it's my home department, this is what I've tried to really impart to my students. We cannot help but be part of the problem, because we all function within these systems. And these systems are large social structures and are built upon layers of history and entrenched norms and values. And within these social systems, there's a concept called the path of least resistance. And this is understood as a choice or series of choices that are the easiest for a person to make, that offer the most reward and the smallest amount of negative consequences. And this can sometimes make people act in a way that they might regret or feel badly about. But because of their social role or the social roles of those around them, they do not act in a certain way that keeps their life easiest. But in practicing sociology, in my pedagogy, I talk to the students about how we are all capable of recognizing these uninterrogated forms of privilege and beginning to work towards more equitable and just practices. And this begins with the practice of locating oneself within these larger social structures, of naming the different privileges. I like to use the example of the invisible knapsack from Peggy McIntosh. And in this example, it was originally designed to showcase how white privilege functions, and it still does this very effectively. But I think the purpose can be expanded to illustrate how all of us, not just white people, but all of us, have different forms of privilege at play. And these are privileges we carry with us without even realizing it. They're carried around with us in our invisible knapsacks, and they allow us to experience the world differently from those who lack those same forms of privilege. And just to quickly illustrate this, I like to use the example of cheating on a test or exam. And I placed cheating here in single quotes just to show that this is a term that's being troubled. So the first thing we have to understand is that, education systems, whether it be high school or university, are set up to value good grades, but not set up in a way to equally distribute good grades to everyone. So cheating could occur because of the structure of the school. Now, one might point out here that people are built differently, that one person might be naturally gifted, for example, at physics, and another might have a learning difference that makes physics difficult for them. And so, surely one would say that the first student getting the good grade and the student who struggles getting the bad grade, makes sense because one has a talent for it and the other does not. Or you could have one student who has a lot of time and energy for homework and studying, and they are truly able to apply themselves, where another student does not put the same time or effort into their work. So surely in this case, it makes sense that one who works gets a good grade and one who doesn't gets a bad grade. Well, the simple answer is quite simply no, it does not, because it comes back to the point that schools are not structured to distribute grades equally or equitably. If they were actually set up to do so, the student with the learning difference would be able to receive the help that they need to learn the subject at hand, such as additional time from the instructor or a tutor, or doing well would not be contingent upon standardized testing that only values one very narrow way of learning. It could be measured differently, for example. Or the student who does not put the time or effort in would have the supports so that the time they are spending on other necessary parts of their life, such as working a job, caring for family, dealing with domestic issues, would not impede them in this way. But the point here is that schools are not set up for such accommodations. They are set up in a standardized way that values those who have talent or time or resources. Frequently, all three of those things are tied together. There are not the supports in place for the equitable treatment of others. It values those with the privilege that allows them to succeed and indirectly and directly punishes those who lack the same privilege by denying them the same kind of success. All of this to say, in my work, locating oneself begins the practice of naming and understanding privilege and oppression and beginning the process of entangling it. So this is one way that praxis and and pedagogy are highly interrelated. Next slide.
Thanks, Keif, for kind of providing that theoretical background to our introduction here this morning and beginning our conversation of our classroom practices. So to pivot now more directly to your role in the classroom over the past year, how have storytelling and relationship building helped you achieve more culturally competent teaching? Carol?
My apprenticeship was virtual in an Indigenous focus course called Indigenous Families, Colonial Impact and Contemporary Responses. My mentor was Dr. Nancy Stevens at Nipissing University. We decided that I would teach part of a lesson for the class addressing content related to colonial impacts. I wanted to do something that would encourage relationship building and create a space for some very difficult conversations. Storytelling was the approach I wanted to try. I wanted to do something that asked the learners, who am I? The terms you see here, empowerment, community, connections, healing, resilience, identity, reflection, holistic, experiences, and voice. These were the motivation and the goals for the activity that I planned to introduce. I wanted to provide an opportunity for students to share and feel validated with their knowledge and experiences. Next slide. Storytelling is culturally universal and inclusive. Every culture has stories. It can make content relevant through connections and making meaning by internalization. It can be used in different ways in teaching and learning, and it can actually take on the role of a teacher. Stories benefit the community and others, and the stories can reveal a learner's knowledge, acknowledge it, and helps others to learn. Stories speak the truth, and it can create community in the class, and it gives space for teachers to share parts of themselves. These concepts align closely to Indigenous worldview, Concepts such as relevance, responsibilities, reciprocity, community, and sharing. Relationship building between teachers and students with one another helps to develop trust. The educator being somewhat vulnerable by sharing something of themselves allows this relationship to grow, and it provides opportunities for everyone to learn and to grow from that interaction. Next slide. So the lesson that I was going to be teaching on was intergenerational trauma. I wanted to approach the topic in a different but relatable way. Using this meme as a metaphor for trauma, I hoped would be an interesting way to provoke thinking, connection, and stories. Storytelling organically provides opportunities for uncovering new ways of knowing and learning. It helps others to see each other as individuals and how they are uniquely different, but then realize the commonalities. The question was, what story does this meme give rise for you for what you know or experience with intergenerational trauma? The storytelling activity resulted in some very interesting and powerful stories. Afterwards, the feedback from students was very positive. As a student and the educator in this activity, it gave me space for my own reflection, and I was able to open up and share my own story. Next slide.
So I had the privilege of working with Dr. Erin Fraser for my apprenticeship, teaching Biology 1002, which is an introductory biology course. And it can be incredibly challenging decolonizing these heavily structured introductory courses. So many of the changes that we made were small changes inside the structure of something that I recognize is an incredibly colonized course. However, as Carol has said in the past, you really have to take your power where you can. And I think that's important to recognize when you're teaching courses like this, where you have this rigidity in the way that you need to structure your course. The way it was structured in terms of the lectures was mostly, it was entirely remote, mostly asynchronous, with an optional review session once a week that the students could come and we would go through examples of the course material. And that decision was made by Dr. Fraser, who is incredibly intentional in the way that she teaches. And I think that structure alone caters to a diversity of learning types. When we're talking about storytelling and decolonizing, some of the important things that we did in our course were to make changes to create a really inclusive learning environment in small ways. So that looked like changing the language that we used relating to genetics and inheritance and sexual reproduction to use terms that relayed sex assigned at birth rather than conflating sex and gender. And other ways were incorporating examples of successful scientists, successful biologists, who are maybe not traditionally recognized. So the typical examples you would hear are examples of white men, and maybe your idea of a scientist is an old white man smoking a cigar, standing over a beaker. But the examples that we use, we were really trying to spotlight scientists from diverse backgrounds. So a couple of examples are really well-known biologists who were overlooked at the time, like Rosalind Franklin and Barbara McClintock. But other scientists were more modern day examples of people who have been successful, like Pamela Ronald, who's using genetically modified organisms to help solve the global food insecurity crisis, and Raven Baxter, who's a popular microbiologist and science communicator who has some really amazing resources on YouTube, and this really incredible Spirit Bear research group who is conducting peer-reviewed Indigenous-led research on spirit bears and other wildlife in BC. So these are small changes, small examples that weren't required, but were just sprinkled in throughout the course to kind of give context to our students that their identity, they're not the only people with these identities in the field in the biological sciences, and also to kind of give them a sense of belonging and allow them to relate to the biologists that we're incorporating, and also to provide this sense of, science is every day. Science is things that you see in your daily life, and it's not these abstract concepts that you can't necessarily relate to. And all of these, again, I'm going to mention, are really small changes. We're not tearing down the whole brick wall and building the course up again. What we're doing is we're taking a brick out of the wall. And if every instructor in these introductory courses takes one brick out of the wall, implement small changes that help decolonize the course, over time, the wall will topple and we'll have a decolonized course. But it's important to also recognize that as an ally, you're not going to get everything right at first. You're going to make mistakes, and it's okay to make mistakes as long as you listen to criticism, you apologize for the mistakes that you made, and then you move forward and you continue making changes. Because if you allow your mistakes to paralyze you, we're never going to move forward in a way that's positive for our students. So I really want to highlight the fact that you can make these changes, these small changes in these seemingly rigid introductory courses that maybe traditionally you would feel like you don't have the power to do that. Thank you. Next slide.
Decolonizing myself. Decolonization is a process of undoing colonizing processes. It is not a one-time event, and reflection is important. I went through the public school system as an Indigenous person, and I learned the same misrepresentations of Indigenous people as non-Indigenous people did. I became very aware of the power of the dominant ways, but it really helps me to understand the power that it holds and just how hard it is to disrupt those ways of thinking and doing. I work very hard at decolonizing myself continuously. As an Indigenous person, I often feel the struggle of both worldviews. As an educator, it is important for me to have this awareness at all times. It is a work in progress, but I strive to decolonize myself critically and holistically. Next slide.
All right. So thank you, everyone. Those were really lovely examples and discussions. So, and for me, I feel like I need to quickly say, I did a mentorship as part of the TSEP program with Dr. Ree Kroll in the Grenfell campus in their it's not sociology, but it's social sciences or something like that, social sciences and culture. And that was really lovely. But I was also teaching my own courses at the same time. The timing just worked out like that. So I focused this part, this sort of reflection on those courses rather than on the mentorship part. So storytelling and relationship building are both really integral parts of my pedagogy. The university classroom has power differentials built into every component of it and is meant to reinforce the shaping of productive citizens. The physical shaping of the room itself, reflects this, with all of the students facing the instructor in a manner not dissimilar from Foucault's panopticon. The curriculum reflects this with its reliance on a canon comprised of colonial texts, and it is reflected in the inflexibility of instructors who have internalized these harmful power dynamics. And this is not meant to disparage anyone or anyone's way of teaching. Again, I approach this from a structural standpoint, and these are all part of processes that have been built into the academy. The path of least resistance for many, both students and instructors, is to adopt them and simply try to make it through and make the best of the situation. However, I think COVID is really starting to change this. And about a year into the pandemic, I had my first serious TAing gig. And I say serious because it was a situation where the professor I was working for had been injured, and this necessitated me taking on additional responsibilities to help them. And I was happy to do this because I could see the care and the effort they put into their classes and their interactions with students. We had a series of conversations about marking and how to approach students' assignments. And the conversations essentially went something like this. The students still needed to demonstrate that they understood the material, but as much as possible, we would try to approach their work with compassion and understanding. More and more, I have been receiving emails from students simply breaking down about how difficult their lives are, how much they're struggling, how isolated they felt. And on top of this, they're expected to perform at the same level they always had at the university. So I've seen this trend continue through my work TAing, during my time at the TSEP program, being mentored, and in teaching my own classes. And so, in my own pedagogy, where I was able to finally have the freedom to try new approaches, I really wanted to center this idea of storytelling and relationship building. So, I want to illustrate two examples to talk about this. The first has to do with storytelling. Now, when I think of storytelling, it's in contrast to the typical lecture style approach taking place in many classrooms. So, in designing my course, I wanted to select material that was not based on a textbook or drawn heavily from academic articles. This is because, partially of the issues that exist in academia, where in many cases material is written in a way that's meant to be deliberately obfuscating and difficult to grasp. For seminar classes and graduate work, of course, I think it's important to critically engage with theoretical and abstract works, but at the introductory level, and I was teaching Intro to Sociology, there needs to be a balance struck where students are introduced to the terms and ways of thinking in each discipline. And I think that this can be accomplished through more accessible work and through more unorthodox work. I wanted to show my students that they could engage in critical work to understand social structures, social roles, and privilege, and that we could have fun while doing it. So you'll see on my slide that there are 4 different books, and these were the main texts that I drew upon in my classes. There are science fiction novellas about cyborgs that have themes of capitalism and disability and gender. There are graphic novels about familial relations and social roles and queerness. Movies and short YouTube clips were also used. And this is how I've approached the concept of storytelling. That in choosing the works to look at, the works would be engaging and different. And by showing the students how one can analyze a sci-fi text, for example, to entangle commentaries of gender after reading gender theory. And I received extensive feedback from the students about how they were, now thinking sociologically about the shows they were watching, the music they were listening to, the stories that they'd read in the news. So in this way, I think storytelling becomes an act of working with dynamic and engaging texts. And the second example has to do with relationship building, and it goes hand in hand with storytelling here. The way we interact with students, I think, is incredibly important, and it sets the stage for what the class will be and how learning will take place. So I wanted to foster, an environment of openness, respect, and comfort. And to do this, I always made it clear that all voices were welcome, as long as they were respectful of others, and that I wanted to hear opinions from anyone who wished to share, and that the lectures were secondary to the organic discussions that could happen in class. And as time went on and the students became more comfortable in this space, there were more discussions. We had lively and animated talks about AI and the potential impacts on human relationality. We had somber discussions about colonialism and the residential schools, and many, many more. They were invited to consider different sociological concepts from their specific positionalities and to reflect upon the ways that their actions could have larger social impacts. One of the ways that turned out to be really effective for relationship building was the weekly reflection exercise I had them do. So basically, every Friday, they would hand in a 1 to 2 page reflection relating to something we covered in class that week, one of the readings, or just something in their lives related to sociology. At the end of the semester, they conducted a larger final reflection where they had to draw on their previous reflections to show how their sociological understanding had changed from the beginning of the course to the end. And in many of these final reflections, students talked about how they had valued the weekly reflections because it gave them a safe space to express their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, or anything else. Many of them treated it as a journaling exercise, and several students remarked that it helped them get back into writing or reading in their spare time as a reflective exercise. And really, I took that as a personal victory. So the purpose in illustrating these two examples is to highlight how I have conceptualized and implemented these concepts of storytelling and relationship building through my pedagogy. All right, next slide.
Thanks, Keif. Um, Wonderful. Thanks for all of you for providing a small glimpse into your classroom to explain a little how you facilitate learning in your teaching within these topics. So often we think, the flip side of facilitating learning is assessing learning. How do we assess student learning? So I ask, how have you been able to work toward more inclusive, culturally responsive assessment opportunities for students?
Okay, first off, I'd just like to give credit of this graphic on the right here. This was created by Dr. Fraser for our biology course. It was part of the syllabus, and it is beautifully done, so I wanted to include it. But yeah, so I'll continue this conversation of being in a heavily structured introductory science course where you don't necessarily have as much flexibility, and this translates to our assessments as well. I want to preface the rest of my answer to this question with the fact that I wasn't necessarily involved with designing the assessments for this course. All of the credit goes to Dr. Fraser and Dr. Butt, who taught introductory biology 1002 this semester. But I think they did an excellent job of, again, taking their power where they could and, implementing small changes that incorporate a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more choice for their students, without necessarily having to tear down the whole structure or, fight tooth and nail to change the way that this assessment looks. So we didn't really have necessarily the flexibility to change the assessment criteria. The final exam, for example, represented 45% of the students' overall grade, and that was fairly rigid. There was no adjusting that. However, wherever they could, the instructors incorporated some element of choice for students. And that looked like in the final exam, there were 12 sections, and the students could choose 10 sections that they felt most comfortable or most competent answering. And those questions were a combination of multiple choice and short answer. So in that way, they were allowing students to empower themselves in their knowledge and also incorporating different ways of asking questions so that they could allow fair representation of the different learning types. Additionally, there were several assessments throughout the course that incorporated that same element of choice throughout the semester. So there were these homework assignments that were called study skills assignments. And in total, there were 3, but the students were only required to do 1. And if they chose to do more, the other 2 could only boost their grade. So in that way, they allowed the students who had more time to work through that and less time to choose to just only do 1 or do 1 or 2. And they wouldn't be, no grades would be taken away from those that could only do 1. And another way, there were quizzes once a week, and in total, there were 11 quizzes, but the students were only required to do 9 of the quizzes. So all of these are just different ways that the instructors incorporated this element of choice and kind of were empowering the students to, take their power where they can in that same way and just really, relate to the course material in the best way that they could. Thank you. Next slide.
As educators, we should have a clear picture of what we are assessing And we should question, what is the assessment learner-centered, and are there opportunities for learners to express themselves in the assessment? And is storytelling valued? I'd like to share, when I first started my apprenticeship, I met with my mentor, Dr. Stevens, and she had me find a traditional Ojibwe story that I identified with, that connected on who I was, and that helped me to set my goals for what I wanted to accomplish. And I have a sincere interest in decolonizing assessment, so that was one of my goals that I created in the apprenticeship. I wasn't directly involved in the traditional assessments, but one assessment that I observed in Dr. Stevens' class was incredibly powerful, and it impacted the entire class, and I'm just excited to share it with you. The assessment involved group presentations on various topics related to the course content. One group presented on intergenerational trauma. One student of the 4 shared a personal story of their journey in overcoming some very challenging issues in their life. The vulnerability and the resilience of this student shared with the class was so incredibly inspiring for everyone listening. The empowering perseverance of this student sharing this part of herself in a course, in a university program, was so tremendous on so many layers. It was just such an incredible experience to be part of. The reactions in the room, even though it was online, there was claps, celebrations, the cheers were flying off the screen. What did this experience teach me? It taught me the significance of creating a safe space for learning, the power of story as a tool for learning and healing, the importance of the relationships in the community where everyone feels like they belong. Everyone in that space felt empowered and connected to this student's story. As I mentioned, it was an incredible experience to be part of it. I don't think I'll ever forget it. And when I've reflected and debriefed with my professor, I just felt such a privilege to be able to be part of that, and that the student felt safe enough to be able to share that story and to be part of it. Miigwech. Next slide.
All right. So, in thinking about how I wanted to plan my courses to incorporate, this decolonial approach, I thought back to my first year Introduction to English course at St. Thomas University. The professor who taught that course told us all something many times over that has really stuck with me from all those years ago. He said that I do not have monopoly on truth, and that in this class, he wanted us to challenge him, to disagree with him, to engage in lively discussions about the material. We were all made to feel like our opinions were valued, that in class our voices carried the same weight as the professors. And because, this was one of the first classes I took, I didn't really have the opportunity at the time to appreciate that for what it was. But going on throughout my undergraduate experience, I came to appreciate, you know, much more astutely just how special of an experience that was, that the professor was telling the class, I don't have all the answers. We can find the answers together. We can work on co-creating this knowledge together. And that's something that I've carried with me throughout my undergrad, master's, and now into my PhD as I teach my own courses. I don't want the students to feel as though their lived experience is discounted as soon as they come into class. That, they're not experts in their own rights, because I think they are. And the views and opinions they bring are just as valuable as the professors. I may have spent, um, more time thinking about the material and more time in a post-secondary institution than the undergrads that I'm teaching. But that does not mean I necessarily know more or have more of an informed opinion. In my intro to sociology class, for example, I had students both younger and older than I am by a considerable margin on both sides, students who had lived in a multitude of countries, students who had been married and divorced several times over, students with children and grandchildren, many others examples of difference, and other examples of profound life experience that they brought to this class. And so as I mentioned in my last response, I wanted to design assessments that would allow students to reflect and draw on their own lived experiences. And I realized I needed to extend this same sort of thinking about how to decolonize my assessments into not just the assignments themselves, but into the practical considerations of the course design. So the primary way that I did this was with due dates for assignments. Early into the pandemic, I saw a post from an academic in the States who said that they had completely thrown out due dates and had incorporated the concept of due weeks, where the students could hand in material any day of the week that it was due. So I wanted to try adopting a similar approach where I told my students that I wouldn't be deducting marks for late assignments. As long as they got them in before the end of the semester, I could work with them essentially. Of course, I encouraged them to get the work in when they could. Otherwise, they could run the risk of finding themselves with assignments piling up at the end of the semester. But my basic approach here was to say, I recognize that things are difficult right now with the pandemic and everything that's going on in your lives. So where I can, I want to offer some small reprieve. And I remember having conversations with a friend of mine early into the semester, and telling them about my approach to due dates, where I won't be deducting marks for lateness, and they expressed some trepidation to me. They said, how will the students learn responsibility? How will they learn that in the real world, they need to have deadlines and due dates? And I thought about this and I said, well, they already have those things, exactly as you've said. Many other parts of their lives, whether it be their jobs, other classes, or just, the personal, the interpersonal relations that they have, these are all things that are giving them responsibility, more responsibility often than they can realistically handle right now. So I think that by showing how there are alternative models to such things, where, compassion can be extended into the academic classroom for a relaxed approach to assignments, for example. This is one small way that I've tried to decolonize my pedagogy. And I can say now, having, not all that long ago submitted my final grades, that most of my students did really well. And the small worry I had that many of them would not hand in assignments, that they would let things pile up way too long, never came to fruition. So I was really pleased and impressed with how things worked. But I also need to add, to bring it back to the discussion that we were having about privilege and our social location, that I certainly recognize that there are instructors who would not be able to do any of this. And it did necessitate quite a bit of additional time and energy on my part. And there are people with, children or families or in more precarious situations who would not be able to invest the time or risk in taking this approach. So, it's not meant to be prescriptive in any way. This is merely, my attempt to try to decolonize my own work. And it's in that sort of collaboration between students and instructors, that I think that we can start to get at that idea of co-creation. To go back to my first example about, my first year English professor, that this is something, this is important to destabilize the colonial norms that exist in the classroom, to have that co-creation between instructors and students. All right, next slide.
Thanks, Keith, so much. We're at time, which is good timing because that was our final experience to share. My thanks to the three of you for sharing your experience today. It's been a privilege and a pleasure working with you for the past year in the Teaching Skills Enhancement program, and I've learned so much from you, including today during your presentations. So I would like, in our remaining time, to open the floor to any questions from those attending. either in the chat or feel free to turn on your mic. I can stop sharing. Sharon.
Oh, I just wanted to say that was fabulous. Thank you so much for that presentation, all three of you. I learned a lot. Carol, I would love to chat with you more about how to incorporate oral storytelling into some other subjects, because I would love that if I could actually do that as an assessment in the sciences. And Caralie, awesome, because I really struggle with these rigid content driven courses and how to start to break down those barriers in a meaningful way. And Keif, thank you for your introduction, because my husband and I actually were both in post-secondary, and we often talk about this concept of identifying ourselves, and it does create a certain discomfort, I think, but also we were questioning, like, what is the value of that? Because on some level, I don't want people to relate to me necessarily as, a heterosexual cis female, but just that I want them to relate to me, Sharon. But I really appreciated the way you introduced yourself, because that really helped me to understand the value of doing that. So thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Carol, I'm sure you'd be happy to share your email with Sharon if you'd like to follow up.
Yes, I will.
I stopped sharing before that final slide with everyone's contact information. If there aren't any other questions, we had kind of chatted about this as a group, as kind of opening the floor to kind of asking you all questions about what you do in your own practice. And Stacy, I saw your comment about wanting to teach, but you also do fantastic work in trying to advocate for inclusive practices. So if anyone is doing something in their own practice to kind of decolonize, or their teaching or related work, we'd love to hear from you too. I mean, I think we've all kind of expressed that none of us are experts in this, and that we're all working toward these goals, and that it's not something that is ever final. So if anyone would like to share something that they're doing, we'd love to hear it. Yeah, go ahead, Sharon.
I put a resource into the chat there, Universal Design for Learning. So definitely that is more about, well, it started out more about accessibility, but it has definitely evolved into an inclusive and equitable approach as well. And I have found that when you're really tapping into those principles, it is a really great way to remove barriers and to be as equitable and inclusive as possible. So yeah, so that's definitely something that we've been doing even in our rigid content-driven courses.
Fabulous. Thank you all so much. So we've come to the end of our session time. So I want to thank you all. That was a wonderful presentation, really thought-provoking, a lot to think about. And want to let everyone know that there will be a recording of the session that's going to be available on the conference site for the CITL YouTube channel. Please feel free to continue this discussion in the Wonderspace. If you guys want to go to the Brightspace, the first page of Brightspace, you should find the Wonderspace there. And of course, there's also lunchtime sessions right now. We're going to have our lunch break, so you can have a look at the lunchtime content that's also on the Brightspace. Thank you all so much for your time and attention today.
Beth, can I just quickly add before we exit, all the panelists, we have to just, on behalf of everyone, we just would like to acknowledge and our heartfelt gratitude for being part of the TSEP program. We want to thank Memorial University for providing this incredible opportunity for us in our education, and we take tremendous learning and experience from it. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech.